Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on what time you're watching us, where you're seeing us from. Hello, welcome, everybody. Welcome, teachers, to today's webinar, where we're going to be talking all about the skill of speaking. Please join us in the chat. Let us know where you're watching us from, what part of the world. Good afternoon, Anita. Nice to see you from Ecuador. Hello, Santi from Chiclaya. Hello, everybody who is watching. Good to see you. I'm so happy you're here with us today to talk about this very important topic, which is developing the skill of speaking with our students. So let's get started. What are we going to look at today? So we'll start with a little bit of SLA theory, right? Second language acquisition theory. What science tells us about speaking in a foreign language. Then we'll talk about some practical tips, activities, suggestions, guidelines to use with speaking. We'll talk about how to work with our students' errors, how to identify them, and how to maybe try to correct them. And lastly, we will finish by talking about rubrics, making the evaluation of speaking less subjective. Hello to everybody who is just joining us. Hi, Gabby from Tumbes. Hi, Sandra from Costa Rica. Hello, Elsie from Lima. Hello, everybody. I am joining the session from Quito, Ecuador, so we are all here in Latin America. Okay. So we're going to start with a little SLA, second language acquisition theory, and see what science tells us about speaking in a foreign language. Okay, this series of webinars for the past 6 months have been based on second language acquisition theory. It's very important to take this into consideration when we talk about language teaching, because this is the science that we have behind what we do in the classroom every day. So it's very important for us as language teachers to really understand this information so that we can make the best informed decisions in our classroom every day, right? Okay, so that brings us to this question, and feel free to answer these questions in the chat so we can be interactive. How do we acquire our first language? When do we start speaking, and how do we sound? Let's think about these things. When we first hear little children begin to speak in their first language, when is that? When do they start speaking? Well, if we look at research, we can see that the average age for a little child to begin speaking in their first language is around 12 months. They say their first word, right? 12, 14 months, this is usually the average period. And then from there, they develop into 2-word phrases, and then they continue to develop their language, right? But they are exposed to their language from the beginning, from when they are first born, right? And how, just like Santi tells us in the chat right now, thank you, Santi, in a natural way. Just listening to our parents, that's how we acquire the language, right? Those of you who are joining us from Venezuela, hello, Elibert, and hello to everyone who's joining us from Bolivia. Everyone who grew up speaking Spanish as their first language, no one was taught the language using rules, right? Your parents simply spoke to you in Spanish. They never said, a ver, se conjuga el verbo hablar, primero el infinitivo, se le quita la... No, they just spoke to you, right? And that's how you naturally acquired Spanish. And now all of you are fluent native Spanish speakers, right? But what happens when we first start speaking our first language? How do we sound? Do we sound like perfect native speakers, completely fluent in the language? Are children perfect at producing their native language? No, we know that they aren't, right? And they make errors. That's natural. That's a natural part of their linguistic development. So if we have a little child who's acquiring Spanish, right, they might say something like, mira, mami, me poní los zapatos, something like this, right? Where we know that according to the rules of Spanish, we would say, me puse los zapatos, right? No me poní. But little children will make these errors and they will continue to make them for years, and especially in verbs in Spanish, because the Spanish verb system is very complex, right? This is normal. We expect this from children, for them to make errors, right? The same in English. If I have a little child growing up in Canada, in England, in South Africa, in Australia, in the United States, anywhere, they will also make errors in their native language. They will say, "Mommy, I eated all my food," right? Or something like that. Or, "Yesterday, Daddy and I goed to the park." That's normal for little kids to do this in their linguistic development, right? But for some reason, we are not so accepting of errors in the second language classroom, in the foreign language classroom, right? We are always correcting errors when our students speak. We have to leave room for these errors because they are a natural part of the linguistic development process. Also, if we consider the development of children linguistically, there is always what we call a silent period. So Krashen, Dr. Stephen Krashen, and other linguists argue for a silent period also in second language acquisition. Students must first absorb the language to form an implicit linguistic system before they are asked to produce it. And what usually happens in a traditional language classroom is exactly the opposite. We will teach students something, and immediately we want them to produce that something, right? Immediately we want them to speak. Even the parents of our students, right? They say, "I want my child to speak English. I want them to speak. I want to hear them speaking." Yes, this is important. This is an important part of the process and of communicating in a language. But are we pushing our students to speak too early in their linguistic development, right? First, our students need to receive abundant quantities of comprehensible input in the language in order to be able to speak, produce something that is meaningful in the language, right? So we have to consider also, at least at the beginning stages of acquisition, that we allow our students to receive more of the language than they are expected to produce. And we also know from second language acquisition theory that our comprehension in a language is always greater than our production. So we can always understand more than we can actually produce, even in our native language. And this is completely normal. Right? So we don't want to be too demanding on our students and pressure them to speak before they're really ready, right? Just like Santi says in the chat here, learning takes a lot of time. It certainly does. Language acquisition is a very long process. In the case of native Spanish speakers, for example, did you know that native Spanish speakers take 12 years to fully acquire the Spanish verb system? 12 years until we can say a Spanish speaker is completely fluent in their verb system. And that's being in the environment all the time, right? Imagine our students who are only in the English-speaking environment in our classroom, or when they can put themselves in English-speaking environments. So it's even more challenging for them, right? So yes, we definitely have to have patience. Okay. So based on this science that we know from second language acquisition theory, we're going to mention a few tips, some suggestions, some guidelines, some possible activities to do with your students if you would like to work with speaking, okay? First and foremost, we must establish clear objectives for every speaking activity that we do, yeah? Set clear and achievable learning objective. What specific skills do you want your students to develop? For example, do you want them to work on fluency, pronunciation, the ability to engage in real-life conversations? What is your focus as the teacher? We have to establish that and be sure that our students are also very clear about that objective or those goals, right? The second one is also extremely important. Create a supportive environment. Foster a classroom atmosphere where students feel comfortable and encouraged to speak. This includes creating a space to make mistakes without fear of ridicule. And this lies 100% on our shoulders as the teachers, because we establish the environment for our classroom. If our students come in and they are happy to be in our classroom, they feel comfortable with us, they know we are not going to judge them or we're not going to yell at them for making mistakes in the language, this is good, because then they feel more open to be able to use the language in our classroom, right? So we have to allow a space where our students feel safe and they are not afraid to say something wrong. They don't need to produce perfect language, because remember, what is our goal in teaching our students English? Communication, right? We want them to communicate in English. If someone says something with the verb conjugated wrong, I probably can still understand them. So we have to allow this space where students can feel like it's okay to make mistakes, okay? Provide real life contexts. Teach speaking through authentic real life contexts. Use practical examples and situations that students know, such as ordering food in a restaurant, making a phone call, something like this, okay? Obviously, we can't give students a situation where they are going to the Social Security office, because students, thank goodness, don't know what it's like to go to the Social Security office. So we need to be sure that we foster an environment that's familiar to them, with familiar situations that they can also contribute to, right? Okay. Yes, what Yolanda says here, it is important to be personally inviting. Absolutely. We need to create situations where students feel comfortable with the people they are talking to. They need to feel it is a supportive classroom. This is absolutely fundamental. Yes, completely. Yes, thank you, Yolanda, for your comment. Okay. Yes, let's continue. Some more tips. Role play and simulations. And here I would like to pause for a moment. I'm guessing that many of you teachers have used role plays to practice speaking, right? The majority of us have used role plays because these are a good communicative sort of way for students to use the language, to put them in a real life situation, etc., right? Engaging students in role plays and simulations to practice real life situations, such as ordering food in a restaurant or making a phone call, but, and here's a very important point, make them spontaneous. Why do we say spontaneous? Because what usually happens? Usually for role plays, the teacher gives the instructions and the students do what? They write. They write the script for the role play, right, for each of the partners. They go home that evening, they read their script, they memorize their script, they study it, and then they go back to class the next day to present it in their classroom. Yeah. What is the problem with this? The problem is there are two parts. Number one is that they're actually practicing the skill of writing in that moment when they're preparing the script, because they're writing the script. They're not speaking the script when they prepare it, right? So this is one issue. The second issue is that it's memorization. They're memorizing lines from a dialogue. And when we memorize things, we don't always have to know what we are saying. And I have a perfect example of this. I remember when I was 13 years old, I went to school in Chicago in the United States. And when we were 13 in 8th grade, we had to memorize the preamble to the Constitution of the United States and also the Declaration of Independence. Yeah. And I could still today recite both of those from memory. Yeah. But when I was 13, I did not understand half of what I was saying from the preamble to the Constitution. The language is more complex, right? And we were never processing what we were actually reciting. We just had to memorize it. That was it. You see? So if we make students memorize role plays, it's not real communication. They don't really need to understand what they're communicating, right? And then when they have to stand up in front of the class, often the problem is not their English, the problem is their memory. Sometimes they forget their lines. And instead of improvising, they say, no, I need to remember the lines from my script. I need to do this way, right? Okay. And then they maybe get lower grades because of fluency, but it's not really their fluency in English, it's their memory, right? So we have to take that into consideration. So if we're going to use role plays as a speaking activity in the classroom, it's fine. But what we should do is tell them, okay, here's the situation. You are the parent, you are the teenager. The teenager wants to ask for permission to go out on Friday night with his friends, and the parent has to have the conversation with him. You have 5 minutes to think about what you can talk about in your conversation, and then you will have a conversation. You see? So we give them time to plan, more or less, what ideas they can exchange, but they're not memorizing. They're not writing and memorizing lines, which is quite different, right? But we do need to give them a little time to prepare the dialogue, because even in their native language, if you give someone an assignment in their native language, sometimes they don't have an idea immediately. So they need a couple minutes to reflect on some ideas, and then they can do a role play, but that's more spontaneous and not scripted, okay? Another idea is group discussions. Encourage group discussions and debates on various topics to promote active communication and improve fluency. Exactly. So in this case, it's a great idea to use debates, because not only are they practicing academic English, if our students are at that level to be using academic English, right? Not only do they practice academic English, but they also have the opportunity to think critically, argument, counter argument. If the other side says this, what are we going to respond, right? So it really gives them the opportunity to push their level of thinking beyond simple knowledge thinking, right? Which is good. Edison says in the chat they need some modeling to start doing whatever activity. Absolutely, modeling is very important to give better instructions, clearer expectations of what students should do. That's an important idea. Thank you, Edison. Conversation partners. We can pair students up as conversation partners to practice speaking and listening. You can rotate partners. We can use partners online. Now that we have survived a pandemic, we have a lot of technology at our fingertips. We can use Teams, Zoom, Google Meets. They can even use Facebook chatting. They can call WhatsApp. We can use, if we have connections with students in other countries, this is an outstanding opportunity to make language more real for our students. Storytelling is another one. Have students share personal stories or experiences. This helps them express themselves and use language creatively. Vocabulary building. We can integrate vocabulary building activities that include word games, flashcards, and vocabulary quizzes. We also have listening and speaking activities where we can combine these two skills because they go hand in hand. So we can combine listening and speaking activities to improve comprehension and oral communication skills. Cultural awareness. This is also an important point. Teach students about cultural norms, customs, and etiquette related to conversation in English-speaking countries. And this is an important point because a lot of times traditional or typical everyday conversation in different parts of the world is very different. It's very different. And a lot of times we leave this cultural component out of our classrooms. So familiarity by the teacher with the target culture and the norms of conversation is very important. I learned this the hard way in Spanish. When I moved to Quito, Ecuador, 12 years ago, I realized that the everyday conversation is different than what I was used to in Chicago. In Chicago, when we greet each other, it's very common, if we are coworkers, to simply say hi. That's it. Hi, or hey, even hey. That's sufficient. But I realized when I was in the university context in Quito that that wasn't sufficient. So me saying hola was not enough. It sounded rude when I would interact with my coworkers in Quito. So I realized that an appropriate way to have conversation in Quito was to greet someone by saying, good morning, and their name. For example, good morning, Maria. How are you today? Right? Or good afternoon, Mateo. How are you? This is more common here. And I never knew that. So I learned it the hard way, and I felt very rude at the beginning. But now I've adjusted, right? So these cultural norms are also something that's very important to consider in interaction, in speaking interaction, right? Okay. I made a separate slide for pronunciation because pronunciation is an interesting sub-skill of speaking. In pronunciation, we can do drills. And normally in communicative language teaching, we say, no, drills are bad. You can't do drills. You shouldn't drill. Drills are artificial. Drills are mechanical. Yes. For morphosyntax, in other words, grammar and vocabulary, drills are mechanical. Yes. And drills do not help us acquire the language, etc. But in the case of pronunciation, we're dealing with a different sub-skill. We can conduct pronunciation drills to help students improve their intonation, stress patterns, and non-native accents to support what we call muscle memory. So if we think our students are native Spanish speakers in most cases of this audience, right? And they're learning English. What is a sound that is difficult for your students to produce? Tell me, what is a sound? You can tell me in the chat. What is a sound from English that is difficult for your students to produce correctly? Yeah, let's think about this one. So here we can think about differences between the sounds in Spanish or the sounds in Arabic or other languages that your students speak. Melvin, this is exactly the example I was thinking of. Thank you so much. The TH sound, right? The TH sound. Perfect. Great. When students try to produce the TH sound, it is a really strange sensation for their mouth because they are not used to it, right? So they say f, 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 like this with their tongue between their teeth, right? Okay. Part of this is muscle memory. In other words, our muscles are capable of remembering how they felt when they produced a certain sound. So if I can have my students practice time and time again the TH sound with both and have them say these words and stress that sound, their muscles will start to realize how that feels. And it's implanted in their memory, right? And so then every time they have to produce that sound, they remember what it feels like. Because pronunciation, remember, is a physical skill. We have to move our mouths, our tongues, etc., in order to make the sounds of a language. So I think this is a good way to, even though it's drilling, it's repetitious, it's good for pronunciation. Yeah. We can also use technology. We can leverage technology by incorporating language learning apps, video conferencing, speech recognition software. Mention some of the softwares you guys have used. Share them in the chat if you've worked with pronunciation. I give you one here that is really linguistic, but it's really cool. So Pratt, which you have in parentheses here, it's pratt.org is the web address. You can download Pratt for free on your computer. It is a free program. And what Pratt does is it creates a visual image of the sounds that you produce. Why would we want to use this? Because then we can compare, for example, I can upload an audio of a native speaker saying a couple words or a sentence or something. And then I can also have my student record themselves. And the good thing is that here we can visually see, because it produces spectrograms, right, which are basically lines like this, dark and light lines, yeah, to show us how their pronunciation looks different than a native speaker's pronunciation, which is great. We have to be careful with pronunciation, though, because students, they're going to have non-native accents. We have non-native accents in our languages that are second language, third language, fourth language. We do not sound 100% native. I have an accent in Spanish, right? Everyone whose native language is not English has a non-native accent in English. That's perfectly fine. That's okay. That's not a problem. The problem only exists if the accent is so pronounced that we cannot understand the English that they are speaking. If that's the case, then we have to really focus on pronunciation. But not sounding 100% native is not a problem, right? Okay, I want to ask you a question. So please respond to this question in the chat. What do you think about using tongue twisters to practice pronunciation? What do you think about using tongue twisters to practice pronunciation? I know a lot of us have used tongue twisters to practice pronunciation, right? They're fun, they're entertaining, they're silly, they make us laugh. Everything like that is great. That's wonderful, right? We have Sandra who says, I've used tongue twisters, which help learners focus on the production and articulation of specific sounds and have fun at the same time. That's cool. That's great. Yolanda says it's a great resource. Edison says they are great help. Good. I know teachers really like working with tongue twisters, and they're fine to work with. They're good. I just want to mention from a psycholinguistic perspective, one thing about tongue twisters. Tongue twisters are very difficult, even for native speakers. Yeah. There is a tongue twister in English that is only 2 syllables. 2 syllables. And it's so difficult in English. It's one of the most difficult tongue twisters in English. And it is toy boat. That's it. Toy boat. But if you try to say toy boat 10 times fast as you possibly can, I personally cannot even say it 3 times. 3. I start toy boat, toy boat. I say toy boat, not toy boat, you see? Or any other that you know in English, right? There are some that are easier than others. Unique New York. That's also a difficult tongue twister. Unique New York. You see? And I'm a native speaker of English. They're fun. They are funny. But we can't be so demanding about perfecting tongue twisters because the problem is not actually your tongue. The problem with tongue twisters is in your brain. What happens with a tongue twister from a psychological perspective, from a psycholinguistic perspective, is that your brain falls into a pattern of sounds and it thinks that you're going to say these sounds, but it's actually different ones. So even for native speakers, it's difficult. Spanish speakers, try the tongue twister, camarón caramelo. Yeah, 10 times fast. Camarón caramelo, camarón. Another one that's difficult in Spanish is Yolanda Loyola. Try that one, Spanish speakers, right? If you try these tongue twisters in your native language, you'll also realize that they're quite difficult. So tongue twisters are fun, but we can't be too demanding on our tongue twisters with our students, okay? This brings us to error correction, which is the part of the very difficult part of working with the errors that our students produce in speaking. Okay. Thank you for sharing your resources, Yolanda. Thank you. Thank you. This is nice to share your resources also with the group. Thank you very much. So here, I'm not going to spend too much time here. We could spend a semester talking about the types of errors, but in general, we have 2 main types of errors that our students make: interlingual and intralingual. Interlingual errors are errors that are caused specifically by their first language. So if we have a native Spanish speaker who said, for example, if I say, how old are you? And the speaker says, I have 17 years. This is caused because Spanish structure is tengo 17 años, right? So there's a direct transfer, negative transfer from their first language to their second language. On the other hand, an intralingual error is an error that any speaker of any native language could make in English, regardless of their native language. So for example, if they conjugated in an irregular verb regularly in the past, if they say, yesterday I eated a delicious hamburger, That's intralingual. That has nothing to do with their first language. It has something to do with overgeneralizing the ED for the past tense in English, right? So these are two main types. And then within those types, we can have phonetic and phonological errors, pronunciation, right? Lexical errors, syntactic, morphological, and even pragmatic errors that are not appropriate for the context. You guys can tell me, what is a common error that your students make? What do you hear your students say a lot when they're speaking in English? Yeah. I know when I hear some Ecuadorian students speak in English, it's very common for an Ecuadorian student to say, I am agree. I am agree. Yeah, and this could possibly come from Spanish, because in Spanish, that's the construction that we use. Estoy, estar, estoy de acuerdo. I am agree, right? Oftentimes, I also hear people is instead of people are. This is a common error too. So please share with us in the chat, what are some of the common errors that your students make when they're speaking in English? Yeah, okay. How do we deal with these errors? How do we correct their errors? Well, this is a very polemic and debatable topic in language teaching and linguistics and second language acquisition, because error correction does not always work long-term, right? So we have some different techniques that we can use to correct errors. I suggest that you take into consideration your students' affective filters. If you don't know about the affective filter, you can watch the webinar from, I think it was April, where we talk about the affective filter. But this, essentially their feelings, right? And their anxiety and everything towards English. Consider this to choose your technique or combination of techniques. As we talk about these, please mention in the chat what techniques you like to use to correct students speaking. So we have recast, which is where we would reformulate the student's utterance correctly. So if a student says to me, for example, oh, I like Houston. The people is nice. I say, oh, yes, in Houston, the people are nice. Yes, they are nice. Where I'm giving them the sentence back that they said incorrectly, but I'm correcting it for them without saying, no, you said it wrong. You know, I'm just kind of doing it in a more subtle way. Yes. We also have explicit correction, where we would say, no, you don't say people is, you say people are. Yeah, where we do it explicitly. This is not very popular nowadays. This is something we did before. We don't do this as much anymore because it's very intimidating for students. Yeah. We also have elicitation, where we would restart the utterance and the student finishes. So in other words, I would say, oh, yes, in Houston, the people, and I'm like waiting for them to continue and to reflect. Oh, the people are very nice. Okay, yes. We also have clarification requests. So we can say to them, for example, if the student says, the people is very nice, I say, oh, excuse me, can you say that again for me, please? The student might realize, oh, I think I said something wrong. I'm going to fix it. And so then they say, the people, I don't know, the people are. Yeah, okay, yes. We also have metalinguistic feedback, which means making them analyze from a more prescriptive standpoint. What are the rules here? Do we say is or are when we're talking about people, right? If we want to focus on the rule itself, yeah? Which technique seems to work best with your students? You can share with us in the chat what technique you think works best. What research tells us, though, unfortunately, is that overt error correction in speaking and in writing doesn't hold long term. In other words, no matter what technique we use, usually it takes a long time for our students to permanently fix their errors. And this is just like little kids when they're acquiring their first language. We can tell the kids, no, you don't say eat it, you say ate. Repeat after me, ate. And then the child says, ate. Okay. And then 5 minutes later, they say, Mommy, look, I eated my vegetables. And they say it again and again and again and again until finally one day something in their brain says, oops, what I'm producing is not what I'm hearing. And they fix it, right? So that doesn't mean that teachers should not correct ever. Yes, you can correct, of course, but don't be frustrated if it takes a while for your students to really absorb that and fix their language. And also, let's take into consideration what we need to correct. We should be correcting if it's a target structure, if it's something that we are focusing on specifically in that class, and also if it's something that hinders or impedes communication. If I can't understand the message because of their error, then we probably need to fix it because communication breaks down. But if I understand, if a student says it depends of the situation instead of it depends on the situation, I can still understand the message. So we don't want to be invasive and correct every single error, but focus on the ones that impede communication. Yeah? Okay. Lastly, to finish off this session, I'd like to just mention a little bit about rubrics. There are a couple videos on the RELO Andy's Facebook page that are dedicated specifically to developing rubrics. So I didn't want to repeat any of that content, but I just want to have a short list here of do's and don'ts for creating rubrics regarding speaking. Yeah. What we do want to do with our rubrics in speaking is to focus on what we did in class. If I've been stressing pronunciation a lot in my class, I want pronunciation to be important on my rubric. Yeah. If I've been working a lot on new vocabulary and I want them to use it in the oral activity, I want to give vocabulary a lot of points on my rubric, right? Allow categories to be worth different point values depending on what you emphasize. So do you want something to be worth 5 points and another category like fluency to be worth 2 points? Fluency is a very difficult category because some of us are not very fluent in our first language, or some of us need to think about our ideas a lot and it has nothing to do with our English. Fluency is a difficult category. So maybe we want to give more points to vocabulary, morphosyntax, pronunciation, and less points to, for example, fluency. Yeah, we have to have flexibility there. Be sure they yield similar results with different raters. This is called inter-rater reliability. If I ask my colleague to use my rubric and we both evaluate the same person, will we get similar scores? We should, if the rubric is effective, right? Don't evaluate items beyond the student's competence. If they are A1 level and you are evaluating their use of phrasal verbs, we can't do that. They don't know phrasal verbs. So if they use phrasal verbs wrong, we can't take points away because they're beyond their level of competence, right? Yes. What Edison says in the chat too is also very important. Test to foster communication, not the test. Exactly. We need to have any type of evaluation, promote communication and not focus simply on testing. Exactly. Penalize students severely. Do not penalize students severely if they are understandable. If I understand the message, we should not be taking off a lot of points from the student because they communicated, right? And that's the important thing. Do not use the same rubric for every speaking activity. If I'm teaching high school and we have an activity where we have a role play and then we have a debate, I'm not going to use the same rubric to evaluate both of these activities, even though they are both speaking, right? I want to use different rubrics because for the debate, for example, content is very important. Your argument is very important. In a role play, no. Yeah, in a role play, maybe the dynamic interaction between the two people in the role play is important, or organization, for example. Whereas in a debate, it's different. So we have to adjust our rubric to the genre of speaking activity that we work with in the classroom. Okay? Yes. All right. To finish up today, as a last thought, I thought this was a very beautiful quote about speaking a language from Nelson Mandela. And he says, if you talk to a man in the language he understands, that goes to his head. If you talk to him in his language, that goes to his heart. So being able to speak another language is definitely a bridge that joins people together. And in today's world, I think that's very important, to reach out, communicate with each other, and form bonds. And we know that language is a major vehicle for being able to do this. So thank you so much for joining us today on Facebook Live. Please do not forget that in 20 minutes, we have a live Zoom session to continue with this conversation. The Zoom link will be posted on the RELO Andes Facebook page in a moment, so you can feel free to come and join us, and we can continue with the conversation, ask questions, share ideas. Please join us on the Zoom session in 20 minutes. Thank you once again, and have a wonderful day. Bye.